Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, whatever it is for you. We are joined by Joseph Robertson. He's a very opinionated journalist based out of UK. He calls himself a patriot and he stands for the British values and the culture of Britain. Also, today happens to be a very auspicious and a beautiful date. It's 31st of October. It's Diwali, and I wish happy Diwali to everyone celebrating out there. So, thank you, Joseph, for joining me. How's it been? How's it going?
Thank you very much. Yeah, it's an interesting time politically in the UK. I've been covering events as a journalist for a number of years, and now more recently as a political advisor and strategist. I've been quite close to what's happening in the UK, and
Mhm.
it's certainly the most vitriolic we've seen politics in this country for a long time. I think there's a lot of side choosing, and I'm looking forward to seeing what we talk about today.
Yeah, uh, I was thinking about our discussion this morning. So, one of the things that I came across as being a nationalist, or the word nationalist, has been framed in a manner that a lot of folks tend to perceive it. Yeah, that the word nationalist has been perceived in a manner that a lot of young folks think that it's something negative. Yeah, that's sort of the aura that has been built around it. So if you have to appeal to an audience that's going to form their mind or going to be voters, early age voters, young voters who want to shape an opinion, what would you define a nationalist as
Well, I
generally?
think nationalist is quite a loaded term. It's really, I mean, nationalist has become a meaning that is not really attributable to it in the oldest sense of the word. The oldest sense of the word literally just means that you care about your nation, which I think everybody would claim to do at some level. And nowadays, it's taken to mean as this kind of xenophobic term where it's more about who you dislike rather than what you like. And I think that that's a very negative connotation. I think that the real meaning of the word is what you care about
Hmm.
rather than what you dislike. And I think that we need to reframe it in that context a little bit more again. I don't think, for instance, if you were an Indian nationalist or a Japanese nationalist or a Hungarian nationalist, you'd perhaps be spoken about as pejoratively as you would if you were, let's say, an American nationalist or a British nationalist. And I think a lot of that problem is coming from the fact that back in historical terms, Britain had an empire, so people feel like nationalism is also to do with colonialism, which just isn't the case at all. So I think this word nationalism really needs to be broken down and redistributed back to its oldest meaning.
Hmm. So that's a good answer there. But we have had recently this fiasco and this with Tommy Robinson. So if you
Mm.
could explain that whole event to our audience and what does that mean? What are the implications of that event?
Sure. Well, Tommy Robinson is a very controversial journalist in this country. He really became famous because he started speaking out about the predominantly Pakistani ethnicity grooming gangs who were grooming and raping young women from very, very young ages all the way into their teens in certain parts of the UK. So this happened, for instance, in Rochdale, Telford, Bradford, all over the country. There were cells of these criminals who were essentially trafficking young women. And Tommy was one of the only journalists who was willing to stick his neck out about this topic. Of
Hmm.
course, it's quite sensitive. It rankles people within the Muslim community because they feel like it's perhaps a contentious issue that could put all of them painted in a bad light rather than just the culprits. Um, and so there's been this kind of dialogue across the country about what's acceptable to say on the issue. And Tommy sort of put that all to one side and made documentaries about it. And one of the documentaries he made, he also named somebody who he accused of having been bullying towards a young British girl who was a immigrant but wasn't meant to be named as part of the court case that was ongoing against him. And so he technically was held in contempt of court, which is what Tommy Robinson has done. He's been held in contempt of court for not following the court order to not name this individual. And he's also been in trouble with the law for other things as well. So he's somewhat of a controversial character. He's not a clean cut character. and people know that about him. So he doesn't always get the defence from mainstream politicians that other journalists might have. And so he's now in jail on the premise of having disobeyed the court order. But the other thing that's quite interesting about his case is that to initially hold him on remand, they used the Terrorist Act. Yeah, so the one thing to know about the Terrorism Act is that it's quite an ambiguous document. It gives pretty unlimited powers to hold people on suspicion of terror for a wide number of reasons. And the reason that the police chose to hold Tommy on suspicion of terror was because he wouldn't give them the PIN number to his phone. And so they assumed that he was hiding some kind of
Hmm.
evidence on that basis. And that's just quite problematic because we have something in the UK called journalistic privilege. It's also the same in many countries around the world. It basically means that you don't have to provide evidence to the police. As a journalist, you're protected, so you don't have to share your sources. So Tommy is now in jail, and regardless of what you think of him as an individual, he is quite at risk because there are high percentages of Muslim gangs in these jails in the UK who want to target him and potentially kill him. So it's become quite a big issue. And regardless of whether people like or dislike Tommy, obviously there are concerns for his safety first and foremost as a journalist and as a British person. So that's the background. And I am somewhat alarmed that the case has become as political as it has rather than being purely judicial.
On that account, there have been a number of cases similarly. I mean, not in the sense of popularity or media coverage, but there have been evidences and cases where the Starmer government is putting people under jail just over the social media posts. So, what's that whole thing about? I mean, as
Yeah.
a journalist, as someone who is opinionated at times, do you fear about your own self, or do you think that it's going to work out fine? What's the
Well,
situation?
yeah, there's been a few things happening over this. So the first thing is that there's been some legislation on free speech, which is to do with misinformation and disinformation, which again is a very broad term. It doesn't really define what misinformation and disinformation are, and it doesn't really say who can decide that, except that it's down to the government. So when the recent riots happened in the United Kingdom a couple of months ago, which were stemming from a gruesome murder of some young children by a Islamic convert who we now know was probably acting as a terrorist from the latest evidence that the police have discovered. There was an outrage, obviously, because young women had died. Oh, not even women, young girls. I mean, these were literally toddlers, some of them. Um, and it was quite a gruesome incident. It set people off in protest, and those protests in some places in the country descended into riots. And those riots were used as a precedent by the Prime Minister to introduce emergency powers, particularly surrounding free speech online, to arrest people on the basis of spreading disinformation. So anybody who called the attacker at the time potentially a Muslim, because it wasn't yet proven that he was a Muslim, could go to jail. People who incited violence in the riots could go to jail, all this kind of thing. But these powers were sort of abused quite quickly. So one elderly lady was sent to jail for a post on Facebook in which she said, "For all I care, the hotels that house certain immigrants can be burned down." Now, she didn't actually say she wanted to burn them down. She didn't encourage anyone to burn them down. She simply said, "For all I care, they could be burned down." So, of course, that's quite a tenuous, it's not necessarily a good thing to say or a polite thing to say, but it's not criminal. And it's certainly, open for interpretation. But that lady and many others like her were sent to jail simply for sharing things online that could be considered misinformation or incitement to violence. So it's quite an authoritarian, dystopian scenario where the real thugs who are walking around on the street, very many of them have walked free, but the people who are posting things that might hurt someone's feelings on Facebook were sent to jail. And so we have this backdrop where, for the first time in British history, really, in the modern time, people are being censored for their opinions. And yes, to go on to the second part of your question, to journalists and people working in media like myself, there are certain risks now attached to what we say online, and that's a big issue. It's not something we've ever had before. in the UK, and we've always been what we would consider to be a bastion of free speech. So now we are at the point where we are calling pretty much very strongly on the Prime Minister and the government to reconsider what happened in the wake of the Southport riots, and to be more friendly towards freedom of speech in this country.
Yeah, so as I understand it, basically the precedence was based out of something that a lot of people would agree to. I mean, you don't want bad stuff to happen, but now the powers are being abused, the law is being abused. This is something that the communists are set to do. This is a classical case of what the communist book is. So, do you see any paradigms or patterns of this government resembling the communists?
Yeah, I actually made a video about this in the last couple of days, where I basically said we need to make communism a dirty word again. And I think that that's one of the
Yeah.
problems in this
Hmm.
country. We've got to the point where we kind of forget entirely about what happened in the Soviet Union, what happened in Maoist China, what is still happening in Venezuela and North Korea, and even in the China of today. And because communism has never directly affected Britain before, we're not very well prepared to understand it, and we don't fully understand how this stuff happens. So right now we have a socialist government. At least two or three members of the cabinet are openly supportive of communists, both historically and current day communists. And that's a very worrying sign, because it means that the ruling party don't care about this word communism. They don't care about the history of communism. And so they're fully prepared to use the tactics that communists typically do, which is to divide and conquer, so to set people against each other in society, and then to try and create some kind of class struggle whereby it ends up being essentially a revolution, although nowadays revolutions don't work as well. So they're trying to do it in a far more soft manner, and that is to make everybody reliant on the state. So they are trying to make sure that people have to rent homes, rent cars, hike up the price of living, make sure that we have to pay higher taxes, all this kind of thing. And it's a slow process, which basically means that they want the state to take control of private property. And that is happening over here. It's happening to the extent that they're trying to break up the family unit. And they are trying to indoctrinate children with ideologies that were not even heard of 15 or 20 years ago. So yes, communism is a massive problem, and I think people really need to understand Marxism a lot more in this country.
Yeah, I keep hearing a lot about the leftists and the socialists breaking the family unit. But
Mm.
can you cite any examples or any ways of how that happens?
Sure. Well, one part of it is social control. So we've
I mean,
seen
how
a
do they achieve
gradual,
that? Yeah.
yeah, it's a gradual liberation of um, laws that will help the family to break down by itself, if that makes sense. So, for instance, the liberalization of abortion on
Hmm.
demand, contraception, gay marriage. Um, these are things which, liberals will say, well, it's just allowing people to be themselves and express themselves. But Marxists see this as an opportunity to actually break down the nuclear family, which is, of course, a man, woman, and their children, and their extended family at times. And this then becomes this kind of chaos where you can be anything you want to be. You can be two men with a lot of children. You can be two women with a lot of children. You can, even as a man now, decide to be a woman. It's a very confusing kind of state of affairs. And so slowly people are beginning to no longer accept the reality of biology. They're no longer beginning to accept that there are certain facts, that we have a purpose biologically in this life, and that also this indoctrination can start at a very young age. So that in schools, as an example, they're teaching about transgender ideology at the age of 5 or 4, in some cases, and it's often quite explicit. There's certain things about sexuality that children just shouldn't see in schools. And of course, all of this contributes to a moral decay in society, which the communists use as an opportunity to come in and grab power. And this is essentially how they achieve breakdown in society. It's by trying to destabilize the religion of a country, the family of a country, and also the national attitude of a country. So the idea that patriotism, to go back to your first question about nationalism, is a dirty word is very useful to communists, because it means that they can reinterpret what it means to be a member of your nation state. So they use all of these tools collectively. It's different kinds of social control. And their ultimate aim is to make sure that you don't have support systems. So, first of all, you don't rely on your family, then you don't rely on your state, and then you don't rely on whatever else it might be. And eventually, you need a solution, and they provide the solution to that problem. And that's how communism is often achieved from inside. And this is something we're now saying happen in the UK.
So, an interesting thing that I've found out and observed is that people criticize election interference in foreign soil and foreign countries, but when it's just the left and the socialist ecosystem doing it, they think of it as some social service. So they would interfere in different elections, but they won't make it seem like it's a bad thing or it's unlawful. Like they have been doing it, as you, I guess, mentioned. They have been sending a bunch of Brits to America to campaign and support Harris. So that situation and stuff like that, where you don't see and perceive them as unlawful. So where does the court and the judiciary stand in all of this?
Well, a lot of the judiciary and the legislative bodies in this country are captured by people who think the same way as socialists. It's a slow incremental change, and one of the ways that communists and socialists, if you want to call them that, work is that they try to capture institutions. So it could be educational institutions, legal institutions, political institutions, and they'll do it piece by piece over decades. It's not something that happens overnight unless they can manufacture a revolution which speeds up the process. But if they're not able to do that, they'll keep plugging away. So, first in this country, they took over the universities. There were a lot of Marxist educators who were pushed into the system in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, all the way up to now. Um, and slowly, those educational systems have produced the politicians of today. They've produced the thinkers of today, the journalists of today. So a lot of these young activists were molded in these institutions. And the same thing can be said in politics with the government under Keir Starmer. A lot of them are almost like student politicians. They don't have a lot of real world experience. They're very ideological. They have this perception that their ideology is the only way forward. And that's why they want to go and help Kamala Harris, because she's exactly the same as them. She's a careerist without much experience in the real world, um, who has this slightly socialist view of things where, they think they can achieve utopia just by adding more money to the national debt. And it's a very crazy way of thinking about life, really. So I think what we have to do to counter that is start to re-educate people on history, on culture, to discuss about whether or not this is the right way forward. And I think especially in this country, and I'm sure it's the same around the world, we're very distracted. We're distracted by social media, we're distracted by crisis, we're distracted by the economy. We're not really aware of our own history and our own situation in society. So I think that needs to be addressed quite rapidly. Otherwise, we will probably be swallowed up by these people who have been at this plan for a long, long time. We're talking decades and decades. And that's how we've arrived at this point. Whereas, well, the legislative system, the judges, the lawyers of today have also been indoctrinated by this system. And so they're willing to let it pass.
I mean, as you did mention, that a lot of institutions have been corrupted, and that has been a gradual process. It has taken years. I mean, people for centuries have been indoctrinated towards the Marxist policy or the leftist policy, and that has translated into the big tech companies today as well. So, how exactly are you going to fight against the big tech giants? And I mean, just there are just a lot of people for you to fight against. So, how do you even start? And yeah.
Well, I alluded to it in that last answer. One of the issues is, of course, educating people, and I think the way to do that really nowadays is the internet. Right, we've got to have a very strong digital presence to counter these people, because at the end of the day, many of them are leading the world's biggest corporations and the biggest banks and the greatest governments in society. So the only way we can really counter that is by having our own structures in place, particularly online. And I think places like YouTube and Twitter are very, very instrumental in that. Our audiences now had first-hand footage of what was happening, for instance, during the Southport riots. because they were able to log on to Twitter and see videos of Muslim gangs walking around with knives and realized that not everybody involved in those riots was far right, which is what the government was telling them. Um, and so there was quite a big awakening at that point where we realized that citizen journalism, citizens who take it on themselves to record the facts and speak about the facts, are in fact possibly the way forward rather than the mainstream press. And of course, you've got things like podcasts. So we just saw a groundbreaking podcast where Joe Rogan interviewed Donald Trump, and this is going to be a catalyst for many people who may have disliked Donald Trump for one reason or another, and they're going to watch this podcast and realize that perhaps their opinions were skewed, and actually they quite like him, and he's quite funny and quite entertaining, and there's not too much wrong with him. And so I think, this new form of media, Elon Musk is doing this as well. It's probably our only way out of this situation, because with a mass awakening of people, with a mass understanding of who's actually in charge and what their plan is, we will be able to overcome that, because at the end of the day, the government requires the consent of the people to actually be in power. And if there are enough people who are opposed to it, then it will inevitably fall. And so I think our digital game, our media, is essentially the way forward.
Yeah, I'll diverge a little. For all the discussion we had, uh, the center point, in a sense, has been Starmer and his policies. I mean, for all it was worth, his victory was way too big. I mean, you can call it a wave of sorts. So that was there, but then recently there was poll, and his popularity has sunk below the popularity of Rishi Sunak, and he has just been in office for 3 or 4 months, if I'm not wrong. So, I mean, I guess people do look beyond his facade and mask. But do you think he's competent enough? Do you think he can do the damage that you fear in the 5 years of his government?
Yeah, so the thing we have to think of when we talk about Keir Starmer's government is that he was elected on a very, very small minority of the voting population in the UK, only 18%, 18%, which is a very small number. And a lot of that is because many people didn't go out to vote. They're apathetic at this point. They've been lied to by both the Tory and the Labour government for a long time. But one of the issues is that the Labour Party also stayed very quiet all the way through the election. They didn't make too many promises, so people didn't know exactly what they were going to get. So they were sort of the best of a bad bunch. But the important thing to remember is that Keir Starmer actually doesn't have even as much of a popular vote share as Jeremy Corbyn did, or Theresa May, even for that matter. He's quite an unpopular leader already to start with. And then since he's had so many crises after becoming prime minister, his popularity, his personal popularity, has gone completely down through the floor. And so there is definitely a route back for patriots in this country. We have an absolute ability and hope that we will win the next election, whether that's a reform government or perhaps another Tory government if they get their act together. We don't believe that Labour will last for long. Particularly, I don't think Keir Starmer will last for long, because I think his own party will probably vote him out at some point in the next year or two if he continues with his incompetence. And so I think Labour are actually in quite a shaky place, even though they have a very big majority in Parliament. And I think there's hope to be taken from that.
Hmm. But alluding to my second question of that subpart of that question, do you think he's competent enough to create the damage that you fear, or the patriots of
I
Britain
don't know
fear?
if he's competent enough, but he has a big enough majority to do that, and that's the problem. So if he has clever cabinet ministers around him, which he does, and they want to put forward what I would call a communist or a socialist agenda, they do have the ability to put that through Parliament, because they have far more MPs than any other party. They don't need any other party to be on their side to pass legislation. And so they can pretty much do what they want at will, which is a scary thing. Now, can their legislation be undone in 4 years' time? Of course, that can happen as well. But in the meantime, they will probably try and put as many people out of the way as possible who they consider to be their political opponents. So it's a very dangerous time for a lot of
Uh-huh.
people who are opposed to them. Many people are thinking of even leaving the country.
What are the agendas exactly that you think, if implemented, would be for the worse of Britain?
Well, we can see some of that actually in Sadiq Khan's London. Crime rates are going to go through the roof because Public sector spending is going to be completely imbalanced. They're not very good with economics. That's one of the big issues with Labour governments. Another massive issue, of course, is more of the indoctrination I talked about in schools and educational institutions, particularly on gender ideology, particularly on harming the family unit. And then another thing as well would be that they are going to continue to open the borders to uncontrolled immigration. And this is a big tactic for them, because actually a lot of their voter base comes from the immigrant demographic, because a lot of the policies to open up the borders came from Labour governments, and most migrants who join us here in the country want to repay that by voting Labour. And so actually you get this problem that perpetuates. And by the way, I've got to say, most minorities in this country are quite socially conservative when they arrive, wherever they come from, tends to be the case. And so actually they're voting for a party that hates them. The Labour Party hates minorities. It doesn't agree with their conservative views at all. And so they're very good at telling you that they're your friend when actually they're not. A lot of immigrants who come to this country want to have their own businesses, large families, they want to have economic security. Well, the Labour Party don't provide for any of that. The Conservatives are hardly any better. But now, of course, we've got Reform as an alternative, who are very much focused on families, small businesses, and this kind of thing. So, I think even an Indian coming to the UK would probably feel out of place with how socialist this government is. They're probably a lot more conservative. And there's a huge disjunct between the Labour Party and what people actually want to see. So although they will enact a lot of these policies over the next few years, I think there'll be tremendous pushback.
Hmm. You alluded to Sadiq Khan. That's an interesting case study, I think. I mean, as the report suggests, crimes in London have increased. Even stuff like air pollution has come into play. And he has won his third term recently. So, all of that on one side, and him winning his third term on the other side, how do you think that correlates? I mean, he has to have done something good to achieve the third term,
Well, he has
right?
continued to appeal to the immigrant demographic in London. And
Mm-hmm.
and like I said, that I think is a trick. I don't think he really cares about them. I think it's a way to gain votes and say, look, we're the party that will support you as a minority, which is just not true. He's done nothing to stop crime. He's done nothing to stop sexual assault. He's done nothing to make our public services better in London. In fact, our transport has become especially bad in London. Our housing problem and crisis in London is being excavated. There's no powers being given to police to try and control the crime. There's also not enough police officers. So if you look at his case study as a Labour leader, and again, another important case study is the Labour leader who was in Wales, Drakeford. I mean, decimated that country, and still is doing so because of different socialist agendas. Like again, clean air zones, which don't work. They don't save any pollution. They just charge you more money for driving your car. Um, and all kinds of things like this. So London is very much a test case for what a Labour government could look like over the next 4 years. And the reason why he keeps getting elected is because he always tells you that whatever will come after him would be worse. It's always this idea that they're the best you can get. It might be bad, but it'd be even worse with the other guy. And so this logic works quite well with some people because they're worried about the cost of living and they genuinely think it could get worse. And so they perpetuate this lie for a long time. And actually, people will and are beginning to wake up. But you need a good character with a lot of charisma to convey this sort of stuff to people. And it's finding that right candidate to pull people forward.
It did work for Johnson. He won two terms in London, if I'm not
Well,
wrong,
and
yeah?
he was very charismatic,
Hmm.
and I think that's sometimes what you need. You see the same kind of thing with Nigel Farage as well. These guys who are very good at expressing things, they're very popular, and they're also very liked because they can have a drink with you and have a chat with you. And we need more of those kind of human personalities in politics again.
That's a really good point you touched upon human personalities. And coming to Nigel Farage, I mean, what is the Nigel Farage impact? What do you think? What do you make of him?
Well, Nigel Farage has always had one key issue, which is getting out of Europe, and he's been working on this for years and years and years. When Britain used to be part of the EU, he's been at it for an extraordinarily long time. His career has spanned at least 3 decades, and he is now at the point where he's having to switch in his career because he sees everything else that's happening with mass immigration, with issues around economy, the green agenda, and all this kind of thing, which he also cares very much about. And so he has come back into politics almost on a whim, really. I mean, he was retired, he was enjoying life, he didn't need to come back into politics. But he made that choice because he felt like this point in time the country needed saving and that he was the man to do it. Um, and so he once again rejoined the party Reform that he originally created, which used to be called the Brexit Party. And he is now championing the cause of what I would call patriots across the country. And they come from left and right. This is something the media don't really understand about Nigel Farage, is he's not necessarily all right wing. A lot of his supporters are quite left wing, but they're very socially conservative as well. And so he's picking up a broad demographic from the centre of the country that the other parties have kind of lost over the years.
Hmm. But as you mentioned, that he has been a central figure in the Brexit movement. But a lot of people and a lot of pundits think that it was the Brexit itself that made the Tories lose this term. They couldn't handle what came with Brexit. They couldn't handle inflation. They couldn't handle the economy. And that is linked to Brexit in some way or the other. So,
Yeah, I mean, I'm a big supporter of Brexit because I believe in sovereignty for this country. I also believe we shouldn't be connected to the euro in terms of currency. I think the pound is very strong, and I disagree with being aligned with the euro. But the problem was with Brexit is that nobody really had a plan for how it would be enacted. And when the original vote was proposed, the Conservative leader at the time, David Cameron, was actually skeptical of leaving the EU. He didn't want to leave the EU, and he didn't think that that legislation would have to be enacted because he thought that we would vote to remain in the European Union. So instead of preparing a deal for what would happen if we did vote to leave, they kind of left all that to one side. And so the future leaders of the Conservative Party, Theresa May, Boris Johnson, and the rest, inherited something which they couldn't deal with, which was a chaotic mess of legislation with none of the plans needed to really carry the country forward after Brexit. And they did a bad job. They messed things up, but they messed things up because there was no plan. And the reason why there was no plan is because the people in this country have not been respected by politicians for a long time. So they didn't think that the people had a choice. They thought that the people would side with the way they think. And when they didn't, well, it was kind of like, well, what do we do now? The people have decided to do what we're opposed to. So politicians in this country are going through a rude awakening, realizing that they're not really in control. It is still the will of the people that makes the decisions. And that's why Reform as a party is so interesting, because people who back Nigel predominantly also back Brexit. And there's a lot of them. That's over 50% of the people in this country. So if those people all get together, it's kind of scary for the major parties. Now, they haven't done that yet, but give it 3, 4 more years of this chaos with the Labour government, and then actually people might start voting differently.
don't you think that there would be a scenario where Tory and Labour, not Tory and Labour, but Reform and Tories,
Mm,
I mean, Tory basically absorbs Reform into themselves if they fear
mm.
of Reforms eating into their vote share. Is that a possibility?
It's a possibility, but I don't know if Reform would want to do that anymore, right? Because they're no longer a small party. They got over 4 million votes in the last election. They have 5 MPs, and they nearly got more. So actually, maybe they're thinking next time, about winning Parliament, about actually winning a general election. Now, I don't know if they will achieve that, but they will certainly believe they can achieve that. And so it will be interesting to see whether or not they actually have any appetite to side with the Tories. They didn't before. And they are the main
Hmm.
reason the Tories lost so heavily in the last election. They took away a number of seats from the Tories because they ate into their vote quite considerably. And so the Tories need reform more than reform need the Tories, and this is a big problem for them. Um, and of course, it will really largely depend on the new leader of the Tory party, and we will find that out this Saturday. But we will see whether or not, if it's Jenrick, for instance, who's the new leader of the Tory party, he's quite aligned to Nigel's message. He might try and strike up some kind of deal. On the other hand, if it's Cami Badenoch, then actually that won't happen because she's more liberal and more close to the centre of the party. She doesn't like what Nigel Farage stands for. So a lot rides on that. But the short answer is I don't think there is much of a deal to be done, and certainly not until it really comes to the crisis of the next election.
Hmm. Let's talk about migration because that has been one of the key issues that shapes London and UK in modern
Yeah.
times. What's your stand on migration? What
Well, I
about
think
you?
migration has been at a completely unsustainable rate now for a number of years. I think that it's completely uh, gone from the original plan, which was, I mean, even through the 1900s, we had maybe 10,000 a year or 20,000 a year of people coming into the country, and it was a nice sustainable level of migration. Um, Now we have, I mean, the last year we've had 750,000 people in 1 year. I mean, this is an incredible number of people. And we don't know where all of them are coming from. And many of them are illegal. We suspect that there might be as many as 1 million illegal, undocumented immigrants in the country because of our breakdown with border security. In terms of the overall numbers of immigration, I mean, the legal immigration dwarfs the illegal immigration. So both are huge problems. And the only way to solve it really is on the illegal side to deport people who shouldn't be here, because that is, of course, what every other sensible country does. Um, but of course, it's got to be done in a way that isn't perceived as racist or xenophobic. And this is the problem for a lot of politicians nowadays. They try to balance this issue because they don't want to be perceived as racist or whatever you want to call it. Um, but the reality is, you've got to be realistic about this stuff. It's not to do with racism. It's to do with economic decline. It's to do with decline in standards of living for the people who are already here. And I think that's a perfectly acceptable point. Every ethnic population wants to preserve its homeland, right? And there's nothing wrong with that. And we've always been a very welcoming, tolerant, accepting country when it comes to immigrants, but only when immigrants are prepared to live the way that Britain lives. And that's absolutely fine. If you go to a host country, if I came to your country or any other country, I'd expect to fit into the customs of that country. And so there is absolutely no problem for us to demand that of the people coming into the country. And if they're not prepared to do that, as we've seen in a number of cases, they should have to leave our country. And that's absolutely acceptable. And so for me, my policy solution to this would be to completely freeze immigration for 3 years, because we saw unprecedented levels of immigration during COVID and afterwards, and to only allow skilled labour and seasonal labour into the country. And this would be absolutely fine. If we need high performing neurosurgeons and doctors to come into the country, there's nothing wrong with that. We need them. That's fine. But to have people to come and, let's say, go and be a binman or take a job at McDonald's, well, what's the point of us economically having people like that in the country? I mean, it's not practical. It puts a strain on our National Health Service. It puts a strain on our economy. And the other thing, of course, is to deport illegal migrants, to find them, to register them, and to process them, and eventually to deport them, because you cannot have 1 million undocumented people, many of whom could be criminals for all we know, wandering around your country. It's just not safe. I mean, we're a population of 68 million or something like this now. So one in every 68 or 69 people that you meet could be a potential criminal. I mean, that's insane. It's just not feasible to continue like this. So those are our simple policy solutions, and I would like to see our leaders take them up.
Sure, and Britain, it's an island, yeah. So we have seen images of people coming in boats and boats and stuff like that.
Hmm.
And as you mentioned, they could be potential criminals, they could be anyone. So, I mean, they do add to the vote share of a particular party.
But that's I think that is they're two separate issues. The legal migration also needs to be stopped, but the illegal immigration, I mean, the solution is very simple. We should have the army on the south coast. we should have patrol boats in the ocean, and we should be turning away any dinghies that come from France, because there are two problems with this issue. One is the fact that they're allowed to stay and they're allowed to be in hotels, but the second one is that they're allowed to leave France in the first place. Well, France is a country with a very well developed economy and a very well developed military, and actually, if migrants are coming to them, young men, particularly of fighting age, who are coming from war torn countries or countries that we know nothing about, and settling in France, and then being allowed to escape from wherever they're being held, to get onto lorries and small boats and come to the UK. I mean, so many problems all the way along the way. So at the very least, we should be sending them back to France, because France are the ones who last had to deal with that problem. Anybody who comes here from France should be instantly sent back there, and anybody who isn't traceable to France should be deported to their own country. And I think this is a very fair and reasonable way of processing things.
Hmm. Have you had any first-hand accounts with these migrants, illegal migrants?
Sure, yeah. I mean, one of the places I used to live in London, just down the road from me, there was a hotel which had always been a normal functioning hotel. And during, I think it was 2022, it was turned into a migrant hotel. And overnight, the door was closed and it was shuttered up, and you would see young men of African persuasion, normally hanging around the door or smoking outside. And it became a very unsafe zone for young women to walk past, because they had no idea who these men were. Many of them would be threatening, or in some way catcall them, or make some kind of noise at them as they go past. And this was in quite a well-to-do part of London, with nice houses and a nice demographic and economy and all the rest of it, and a lot of young families around with children. And it became quite a dangerous street to walk down. And to me, that is more than anything else. Thank goodness there were no murders and no rapes on that street that I know of, but there could have been. And in some parts of the country, there have been, because many of these people do not understand our cultural norms, particularly when it comes to women and to respect. And so we are left with a problem where we're not allowed to talk about it, otherwise we are called racist. And the police are not allowed to do anything about it, because then it becomes political. But we all know it's a huge problem. So, we need people to talk about it more.
Hmm. And let's say if you do talk about it, what happens then? I mean, there's just people become aware of it, but if administration isn't on your side and thinks it's going to make it
Yeah, well, I
political,
think it's all about putting
so.
pressure on. There's putting pressure on through the media, through any means possible, so that the government are embarrassed into doing something about it. I don't know if Labour will have the capacity to do it, because they clearly have an ill intent towards their own people. But the next administration certainly will have to do something about it. And in fact, if we put enough embarrassment on Keir Starmer and the Labour government, perhaps they will be forced to act, because they'll be so worried about losing any kind of control. And this is what I encourage people to do: to write about this, to read about it, to continue to disseminate it on social media, to go on television if they can, to do any means necessary to actually speak about this, and ultimately to have peaceful protests, and to allow the government to know that we are not happy with how things are going.
Mhm. And for the last segment of the today's session, I'd like to discuss something that is very important to you and very important to India as well. I mean, just in a scenario, if someone was to chant threats and deaths to Britain in Indian soil, you wouldn't want that to happen. You would want the Indian government to take charges and action against that. That's logical, and that's how things should be.
Yeah,
But uh, there have been incidents and cases where a particular group of people have been chanting against and protesting, and not too peacefully, I might add, against India and the sovereignty of India. But the administration again has failed to do anything that can be perceived as concrete or
yeah.
decisive. So, what's that situation like? I mean, from
Well, we
your
have this
perspective.
issue, particularly in London. We've been having marches which are more to do with Palestine than anything. So this is groups of people who believe that Palestine should be liberated, so called, from the Israeli state. They're protesting against it. They're predominantly Muslim. and they have a very, very violent message. They're not necessarily violent themselves, but they have a very violent message to deliver, which is very often speaking about killing or death to people who are Israeli or Jewish. Very often not respecting the fact that they are in Britain when this happens. And we also have another problem with it, with a gang called the Muslim Defense League, who actually were one of the reasons why the Southport riots got so bad, because they were walking around with knives and machetes in broad daylight and trying to attack people, and they did attack people. And of course, none of this was covered in the media, because again, they don't want to be called racist or whatever it is that the term could be that's thrown at them. But this has to be talked about. Violent Islamism in this country is a real problem. It's not part of British society. It never has been. It was never permitted to be part of British society, and we've never consented for it to be part of British society. And so, to moderate Muslims living in this country and around the world, I say that you've got to start calling it out. If you don't want to be associated with Islamic terrorism, you have to be willing to say that your fellow Muslim, who is perhaps a jihadist, that they are not part of your community, that they are not welcome, and that actually they need to integrate into society or leave. And unless that happens across the world, this problem will continue on and on and on. We have allowed too many Muslims into our country to ever think about changing unless they themselves are willing to change. And there's nothing wrong with being Muslim. There's nothing wrong with being in this country as a Muslim. But if you're not prepared to call out radical terrorism when you see it, and by the way, there are plenty of Muslims I know who do that, and I respect them greatly for doing that, because they could get in a lot of trouble for doing it. But we need more of them to do that. Otherwise, there won't be an end to all of this.
Mm-hmm.
No, I just
Yeah,
said, well,
thank
the
you.
problem is that not a lot of people really understand Islam. They haven't studied it. And of course, if you study Islam, you understand that part of the mission statement of being Muslim is to go out and take over other nations for the sake of Allah and for the sake of Islam. And there is a big debate in Islam whether or not this should be forcible or peacefully. But both groups are agreed on the fact that they have to go out and convert other nations. And some of them try to do it
Mm-hmm.
peacefully and some try to do it forcibly. And historically, Islamic conquest has always been forceful. It has always been under the pretext of violence, regardless of where it's happened. And only in the last few hundred years have Muslims started to take over societally, peacefully, rather than forcefully. And I have no problem if a Muslim wants to come and live in my country, but I do have a problem if they want to take away my Christian identity and my English heritage. And I think it would be exactly the same in India as well. You will have your own heritage, your own culture, and your own religion, which does not want to submit to Islam. And so Muslims must either respect that or leave.
I mean, in a sense, what you and I seem to agree upon is basically if you go to Britain, you should feel like it's Britain. If you go to France, you should feel it's France. If you come to India, you should feel India.
Absolutely.
And that's something that should be respected, and that's something you should stand up for. And I think that's a really nice message that every ethnic group across the world should take care of and should abide by. On that note,
Absolutely.
thank you very much, Joseph, for doing this podcast. It was nice having you. I look forward to seeing you again and hope that we can continue to discuss. I mean, there are
Yes.
endless topics, and great discussion today. Hope to see you soon. Any final words, final appeals, anything?
No, just thank you very much, Pritish, for having me, and thank you to your audience for watching. And if you want to find me, then I'm on Twitter at Nero_returns.
I'll leave that in the description as well. So thank you once again, Joseph. It's good to see you. Namaste. Bye bye.
Take care. Thank you.